Morning. Welcome back to Ancient of Days. Our next speaker here is Michael S. Heiser. He just completed his Ph.D. He's an ancient languages and ancient text and ancient history scholar from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he is bringing us the question of if you could actually prove that ETs were real and visiting Earth, or whether they were visiting Earth, what kind of problems might that pose for the Christian worldview? I mean, is man alone according to the Bible, or how unique are we compared to everything else? He's very uniquely qualified. I don't need to tell too much more to waste his time. He can do it a lot better than I am. This is Dr. Michael S. Heiser.
Okay, as we get this started here, as Guy said, I'm more capable than he is of wasting my time. The focus of this session is, as he said, to ask the question, could Christianity accept a genuine extraterrestrial reality? And just by way of prepping this, by way of sort of setting this up, you, if you're at all familiar with me, or if you heard one of the other sessions, you know that I really have two sort of operating paradigms for this kind of question. And in my book, The Facade, I actually cover both of them. One is that what we see as the extraterrestrial phenomenon, and I do take it seriously. I do take people, take their experiences as credible reports. You know, there are always some that are making something up or just need attention. But I think the vast majority of people who, let's say, experience some sort of abduction experience, that I don't think everybody's lying. I do think there are credible researchers in this area that have produced a lot of good work to suggest that these people should be taken seriously. But one possibility for all that is that what we're dealing with here, especially in view of the correlations with the abduction scenario, what you read in the literature from abductee testimony, what we could be dealing with here is some sort of mimicry of a Genesis 6 type event, where you have some sinister operation here, where the sons of God or some sort of entity, some sort of divine entity, fallen entity in biblical theology and later Jewish theology, where you have this activity sort of repeated, that it's sinister, it's evil, these entities aren't really extraterrestrials defined as beings who actually live on another planet, who have determinate lifespans, who need to eat, who reproduce, who hate their jobs and all that kind of stuff. Just have a mundane existence. They could be actual entities masquerading as extraterrestrial gods. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, to set this up again, is that let's just set all that aside that I just said, the Genesis 6 stuff, the demonic stuff, and let's just assume, for the sake of the session, that E.T. lands on the White House lawn like everybody wants to happen to prove this, or some other proof is put forth that there actually is an intelligent, I'm not talking microscopic particles here, but that there's an intelligent extraterrestrial reality, and this is actually proven scientifically beyond any reasonable doubt. If that's the case, and if it can indeed be divorced from all this demonic stuff, then what would the impact be on the Judeo-Christian worldview? And those are the presuppositions we're going to take into this and the question we're going to ask. Now, there is a problem as implied in the title. The title suggests that there are many in the Judeo-Christian camp who would be troubled. Hence, if not, why ask the question? This all goes back to, by way of introduction, to something called the Brookings Report, as far as the attitude today that if there was an extraterrestrial, Jews who take the Scriptures seriously, Christians who take the Scriptures seriously, just could not handle this. That approach, that idea, that assumption really goes back to Brookings as far as people in the know. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but the Brookings Report was done roughly in round numbers in 1960. Congressional report for NASA, and part of it dealt with the implications of the discovery of extraterrestrial life. And this paragraph more or less just says, the first line here, anthropological files contain many examples of societies, speaking here of human societies, sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies, espousing different ideas of different life ways. Now what that means is that anthropologists, people who study people and cultures, I sort of pointed out the obvious. When one culture encounters another culture, and that encounter sort of displaces what they thought about themselves, it can be a disturbing experience. Well, we all know that, but the Brookings report went even further. It actually, this is a direct quote from a footnote on page 225. It actually says that fundamentalist and anti-science sects are growing apace around the world. For them, the discovery of other life rather than any other space product would be electrifying. And if you go down to the last line, if superintelligence is discovered, the results become quite unpredictable. To summarize this quotation, what they're saying is, look, people who are really, in these conservative religious groups, if you actually found intelligent life out there in the universe, this would be a really disturbing prospect for them, to the point where the results become quite unpredictable. We don't know what would happen. And this stance on the part of NASA, on the part of the government, has sort of carried the day as far as disclosure questions. You always hear this when the subject of why doesn't the government just be more honest? Why don't they act more forthrightly? If you saw Richard Dolan's presentation and John Greenwald, you'll know that the government specializes in obfuscation when it comes to getting any information about what it actually knows. And part of the reason that they would give, and have given in print, is that the social religious fabric of not only our country but around the world would just be too dramatically affected. Now, to be a little more precise though, the people we're talking about here and the people I'm talking to in this tape are theological conservatives. And what that means is people who, again, in the Judeo-Christian camp, who would take the Bible at face value, would believe that it's inspired and authoritative, and that it contains an accurate, but perhaps not necessarily complete, record of creation events. These are the people that the Brookings report were afraid would just not be able to handle this, as opposed to theological liberals. And what is a theological liberal? Well, this is someone who doesn't really view the Bible as the only authority or infallible. It is quite open to negative criticism. And the reason I point this out is that nearly everything that you'll read, if you actually went to do some research on this, what about Christianity and extraterrestrial life, almost everything that's been produced has been produced by or for the theological liberal camp. In other words, those whose view of the Bible is, I'll say it this way, is low enough that, we really don't care. If an ET would come along and that sort of produces the assumption, or in our minds the fact that the Bible is wrong, we would expect the Bible to be wrong anyway, so who cares? We're not talking to that camp. We're talking to people whose worldview does not allow for a Bible, a text, their religious book, to just be riddled with errors, and to make an error so fundamental as to the matter of extraterrestrial life. So I want to be clear as to who I'm speaking to. And I'm specifically speaking to those who are conservative. Now, there has been one attempt recently to sort of assess in the mind of the researchers how the religious community in our country would respond to an extraterrestrial reality. And I'm going to tip you off as to where I'm going here. This survey, which you may have heard of, if you perhaps have been to the NIDS website. If you haven't, I recommend it. There's a lot of good stuff on it. But the NIDS people paid for and commissioned, conducted something called the Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey. And this is taken directly from the website, from the survey's own abstract. And what they did, to summarize here, is they sent out 1,000 surveys to find out what the impact would be from essentially the mouths of the spiritual leaders in various denominations and congregations. You'll notice at the bottom, the results that they got are based on a 23% return. So 230 of the 1,000 surveys were returned. The country was also divided into 5 regions to do this methodologically, and 563 of the surveys wound up going to Protestant churches of various denominations, 396 to Roman Catholic churches, and 41 to Jewish synagogues. So they tried to sort of hit representationally the major groups. Now the results were that 81 Protestant respondents, again only 81, answered the question that dealt with the approximate size of the congregation. The researchers wanted to know, well, how many people does your church, and hence your view as the pastor or the rabbi or the priest, how many people does your church represent? And so you get these figures in the survey data about total families that the respondents represent. Protestant, you have a little over 35,000. Roman Catholic, a little over 56. And the 6 Jewish respondents would amount to 1,445 families. Now, that's a total of 132 congregations and 93,477 families. Based on a U.S. population of 280 million, go down to the red, these 4 religious bodies represent 51% of the U.S. population. Again, this is drawn from survey data. What that means, though, and this is me speaking, less than 1/4 of the surveys were returned, and there's no way to tell how theologically conservative the individual minister, priest, or rabbi was who answered the survey, because the researchers didn't ask that question. They didn't ask any questions, in fact, to assess, well, what's your view of the Bible, what's your view of this, to try to get a feel for how conservative they were. The more conservative the respondent, however, the more likely they would be to feel troubled by certain questions. And it's my guess, and it's only a guess, based on people in the ministry that I know of, and trust me, since I do this, I run into different pastors and, that I know, different academics in the wider Christian realm who just wonder, why are you doing this? And when you tell them, it's like, well, surely this just must be evil, and so on and so forth. Because they're very conservative, they don't want to entertain the possibility. So I would suggest that questions like this would really bother a theological conservative. And chances are they would just throw the survey away or answer very negatively. I don't think they would answer very positively to things like this. Do you think genetic similarities between mankind and an advanced extraterrestrial civilization would challenge the basic religious concepts of man's relative position in the universe? That was question number 5 from the survey. Question number 6 was, if an advanced extraterrestrial civilization had religious beliefs fundamentally different from ours, would it endanger organized religions in this country? Chances are a theological conservative would say, yeah, well, it would endanger mine. 10, if an advanced extraterrestrial civilization proclaimed responsibility for producing human life, if the ETs said, we're your creators, would it cause a religious crisis? If you're a religious conservative, this is completely contrary to what the Bible says. And of course it would bother them, again, if they're theologically conservative. But in the survey, you don't really know how conservative or liberal the respondent was. The other problem is the math. By the survey's own mathematical calculations and sources, and assuming a family is 4 people, a couple with 2 kids, we'll skip the dog, then the survey accounts for only 373,908 people in the United States. So there's the math. You get the 93,477 times 4. So you know how I got this. If we double that, if we're really generous, because again, only half the respondents actually gave their congregation size, so let's double it. That's 0.005% of the population of the United States. What I'm suggesting here is that this survey doesn't really cover what needs to be covered. By way of illustration, I put this in a bar graph, and yes, there is a bar down here for the percent, again, of the population, but it's so small it doesn't even register on the bar graph to graphically illustrate it. So what I want to do, having sort of set this up, so you know who I'm targeting, and you know that I'm thinking that a lot of the efforts to date just haven't done a whole lot, is I want to demonstrate that the issue is important. I'm speaking again for those who are perhaps in the room who are, again, their background is a conservative Christian background, or you know people who have that background, or if you're listening on the DVD, if those categories apply to you, I want to demonstrate for you that the issue is important. There really are theological questions that we need to think about in relation to this, and also to demonstrate that compatibility, in other words, a genuine, a very real extraterrestrial reality is compatible with a conservative, a theologically conservative Christianity and Judaism. My rhetorical questions here, they are sincere, even though they're rhetorical. Are you worried about your faith? Well, I would suggest that you need to stop hiding. There is a coherent response if this were ever the case. And if you like to trouble Christians over the issue, you like to needle them, perhaps go after them a little bit about their faith, I would hope that you wouldn't be as intellectually dishonest and frankly as cranky after today, after you see this, because there are coherent responses. Historically, how did it come to this? I mean, how did we get to this position where the church just really does not want to entertain this question? The reason I ask this is because it didn't used to be this way. Now, the debate over whether intelligent life exists elsewhere in the universe, again, just departing from all the demonic stuff, the abduction stuff, you might be thinking, well, you can't really depart from that. Again, just for the sake of the discussion is why we're doing it. But the question of whether there are other worlds is actually very old. It goes all the way back to Aristotle and Plato. So it has a long heritage. They were opponents, though, to the idea. They didn't like the idea that there were other worlds. And most early Christian authors were also generally opposed to extraterrestrials, since they tended to use Platonic and Aristotelian philosophy in the articulation of their theology, the explanation of different theological concepts. Augustine of Hippo, this is the famous St. Augustine, also attacked the idea, and much later Aquinas was opposed to the idea, mainly because he didn't like Aristotle. Later on, though, when you get into the High Middle Ages, in 1277, Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, issued, now catch this, issued a condemnation, and he's Roman Catholic, he issued a condemnation of doctrines that seemed to limit God's omnipotence. So he actually produced a list that, if you believe this idea, okay, or if you reject this idea, you're limiting God's omnipotence. And on that list was this. One of the propositions condemned was, quote, that the first cause, God, since he brought everything into the world, or everything into creation, the first cause cannot make many worlds. If you affirmed this, if you believed that God could not make any worlds, Tempier was saying, you should be condemned, your idea should be condemned, because you're limiting God's omnipotence. Omnipotence is the idea that God can do anything that he wants that's consistent with his own nature and his will. So here you have a bishop of Paris saying, you really need to believe this, because he certainly could have doing it. He could have done it. Now, theologians who followed the lead of Tempier didn't argue that God did create other worlds. Some did, some didn't. But the question was only that he could. So they're opening the door to a positive view of this. That openness led to the introduction of what Christian philosophers would later call the principle of plenitude during the Renaissance. So a century or so later. This was a philosophical, theological idea, not a biblical one. I mean, you're not going to get this from a Bible verse. But it was a theological idea that posited that an omnipotent creator like that proposed in the Bible must, and here's the key difference, must of necessity bring to be all that is possible to fully honor his own goodness and power. Hence, Christian theology went from seeing other worlds as possible to argue that they might even be necessary for God to really show how great he was. So that became a workable idea. Nicholas of Cusa, a famous figure in church history, encouraged the idea, and he advocated in print that not only could there be a plurality of worlds, but life probably also existed on the moon and the sun. Nicholas was a priest, later became a cardinal, and he was the first prominent Latin Christian scholar to embrace the idea of extraterrestrial life. And he wasn't the only one. Now, later on during the Reformation, the principle of plenitude did face some opposition again, particularly from Melanchthon, who was a Lutheran reformer, who in 1550 warned that the Copernican cosmology would lead to the idea that Christ's incarnation and redemption could have occurred on another planet. Now what that means is, what Melanchthon's concern was, is that if we have all these other planets out there that are populated, he was afraid, or expressed the concern that, hey, if we affirm this, then we might also have to affirm that God could have sent Jesus to a different planet and effected the atonement for them and perhaps not us. Or later on, this idea is going to be blown up into the, I'll just call it what it is, into the pseudo-theological problem that if there are other worlds, then Jesus has to be incarnated on every one of them and live and die on every one of them and resurrect on every one of them. That's going to become an objection to the idea of extraterrestrial life. But Melanchthon was more or less concerned about humanity losing its position as the redeemed, or as the target of redemption more properly, than somebody else. So he was opposed to the idea. Belief in extraterrestrials among Christians and Christian theologians continued to be quite prominent during the Enlightenment, 17th and 18th century. Near the end of the 18th century, the consensus within and without the church, so both people in the church and people who had nothing to do with the church, was that the universe was teeming with intelligent life. And so many Christians believed the possibility actually enhanced one's religious perspective, again, in light of the principle of plenitude. So it was cool, it was in vogue, it was permissible, it was allowable to believe in other worlds as a Christian at this time. The acceptance of extraterrestrial life among Christians was soon undermined, however, by one of the Enlightenment's major figures. Thomas Paine, again, we've heard of Thomas Paine from history class in the Age of Reason. He argued that astronomical science had made it impossible for any thinking person to accept the central Christian notions of a divine incarnation and redeemer. And in the course of this debate, Paine became a firm deist. In his own words, here's how he put the problem as he perceived it. He says, "From whence could arise the strange conceit that the Almighty should come to die in our world because, they say, one man and one woman had eaten an apple? And on the other hand, are we to suppose that every world in the boundless creation had an Eve, an apple, a serpent, and a Redeemer?" He's saying, look, if this is true, and if the Christian doctrines are true, and if it's true that there are other worlds, wouldn't this whole thing, this whole atonement idea, the whole fall and redemption idea, and the incarnation that Christianity has as its central beliefs, wouldn't that have to be repeated on every world that existed? Or else they wouldn't be redeemed. The Son of God would have nothing else to do than to travel from world to world in an endless succession of death with scarcely a momentary interval of life. There's so many worlds out there, you just have to go somewhere and just die all the time. So he thought it was absurd. Numerous Christian authors in the period after Paine responded to his polemics. Two of the most successful were Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University during these dates, and Thomas Chalmers was a famous Scottish preacher. So they just thought Paine was out to lunch and that the idea of extraterrestrial life was just fine within Christianity. And Dwight and Chalmers, by the way, these were major theological figures. These were not hacks. Okay, these were not people who didn't know theology. They were among the leaders in Christian theology at the time, and they thought it was just fine. They just didn't buy what Paine was saying. Support for the idea of extraterrestrial life continued through the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the church, but it soon became the threat that many Christians see to it today, and that was really because of Darwinism. With the advent of Darwinism, Christians who took the Bible's claim of a divine creator seriously began to view scientists as the enemy. Okay, that was one of the key intellectual movements or changes that has led to the situation as it is now. Once Darwinists, and here was a big, and it still is a very big issue, once Darwinists came to the conclusion that the discovery of extraterrestrial life would amount to added support for naturalistic evolution against the idea of a creator, the church became increasingly hostile toward the idea. So the fact that non-Christian secular scientists linked the idea of, hey, if we discover extraterrestrial life out there somewhere, then that supports evolution, because life would have had to evolve somewhere else. That linkage, which I'm going to tell you right now is not logically necessary at all, but that linkage really troubled a lot of people in the church So they were just immediately, they began to be predisposed against the idea of extraterrestrial life. Now, some observations. Historically speaking, the church was often quite supportive of the idea of extraterrestrial life. That's just a point-blank historical fact. The idea of extraterrestrial life did raise important theological questions, but these questions were not viewed as threats to the faith by many. Two things, I believe, drove the church away from the extraterrestrial question, and here's the important part, neither of which arose from the Bible itself. And they were manufactured pseudo-theological problems from enemies like pain, and the logically unnecessary linkage of naturalistic random evolutionary theory to the question itself. Now, the former of these, Paine's argument about Jesus having to die and resurrect on every world, made Christians wonder if the extraterrestrial life was a problem, and the latter forced Christians, the whole question of evolution, forced many Christians in their minds to distance themselves from the idea by default, thinking that if we accept this, then somewhere down the road, someone's going to argue that we must accept evolution as well. Now, getting a little more modern here with the situation as it is today, we're still dealing with the same categories. And I'm going to start with the second of the two back here. Here are the two categories, pseudo-theological problems and this logically unnecessary linkage. I'm going to start with the second one to jump into how I would respond, how I think the church can quite easily respond to the issues and affirm the possibility that their worldview is compatible with an extraterrestrial reality. Now, the notion of intelligent alien life that it proves, or at least supports, the theories of naturalistic evolution is, again, the modern version of today's unnecessary link. Panspermia, if you're not familiar with this term, is the idea that life was seeded from space. Usually this takes the form of what scientists would call undirected panspermia. It's accidental. Life particles are floating around out there in space, and they land on Earth and create life. There are those, though, who would favor directed panspermia, that extraterrestrials actually brought life here or came here and started life. The first major figure in science to say this was Francis Crick, who you might remember, Crick and Watson, co-discoverer of DNA. He thought that evolution could not explain the complexity of life, and so he theorized, well, somebody must have brought it here. He did not, of course, want to say that there was a creator. But would an extraterrestrial reality actually prove either this idea, panspermia, or evolution? I would say to some extent the objection is completely irrelevant. There are many theologically conservative Christians. Again, I'm talking about people who believe that the Bible is the Word of God, who believe that Christ was God in the flesh, who believe that he died and he rose again. I mean, all the major doctrines of Christianity. There are many theologically conservative Christians, especially in the sciences with advanced degrees in those fields, who embrace the theory of evolution, albeit as a process created by God. Those who do this would call themselves theistic evolutionists. God created the evolutionary process and lets it run. And or intelligent design theorists. Now, intelligent design theorists do not all embrace evolution. Some of them reject it. But the fact is there are lots of conservative Christians out there who aren't troubled in the least by evolution. And just on a personal note, I know a lot of these people. I'm at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I go to a campus church there. And our church, for some reason, is heavily, and I mean heavily, heavily stilted toward the sciences. I can't go to a service without bumping into half a dozen PhDs, because we have a lot of faculty who are members and leaders in our church. Our church has a lot of graduate students in a lot of fields, but most of them seem to be scientists. By way of example, the head of the botany department at the UW is a member and an elder of my church. The head of environmental studies, member of my church. We have two research physicists, both with PhDs. It's a husband and a wife team who work at the cyclotron in Madison. They're members of our church. They affirm all the cardinal doctrines. I have two friends whose PhDs are in artificial intelligence. We got grad students in entomology and biology, chemistry, biochemistry, the whole 9 yards. And they all believe the faith. They all practice the faith. They're all firm Christians, many of them, not all of them, I don't want to pigeonhole all of them, would probably be comfortable calling themselves theistic evolutionists. They all like intelligent design. They're all fans of that movement. So, in some ways, this objection is just pointless. It's going to be made by people who just are not acquainted with Christians who have advanced degrees in the sciences. By the way, do you know who Francis Collins is? The head of the Human Genome Project. He's a Christian. You don't believe that? Go on the internet, put Francis Collins into your browser and Wheaton College. You'll get his address to Wheaton College, which is a mainstream evangelical school. You'll get his lecture on his testimony, his faith. He is the head of the Human Genome Project, MD, Ph.D., the whole 9 yards. I could stand up here and just catalog PhDs in different fields to you, but I'm not going to waste your time doing that. For those Christians, the concern is not evolution, but naturalistic, purposeless, undirected evolution. What a Christian in the sciences would object to is that evolution is just totally random. It was not started or given to us or initiated by a creator. This is what the people I know object to, that you take God out of the process completely. If alien life forms, intelligent or not, were discovered, those in this category would just assume that God started the evolutionary process. It's okay. Other life forms out there on other planets are part of that process. God is the ultimate creator. So where's the issue? And I've actually had them ask me this. Well, where's the problem? Well, you're preaching to the choir professor. I'll use their first name, but for the sake of this, I'll just call them professor. I mean, to them, it's like a no-brainer. Why do people have a problem with this? Well, we usually get into an interesting conversation then. Those who reject evolution, however, again, there are many Christians who are just opposed to evolution completely. Just from the get-go. Those who reject evolution would, by default then, be forced to argue that God created alien life forms just as he created life on Earth. Now, I would submit to you that this is exactly what many Christians before Darwin believed. Principle of plenitude. So even if you're in this group, even if you reject evolution, all that does is put you back in the other category. God's omnipotent, he can do what he wants. He's still the creator. But I do want to unpack this a little bit, this alleged problem, to show again that it's not a very effective threat to the theistic worldview and the Christian worldview. Assuming evolution is valid for the moment, its validity in no way explains the origin of the matter present at the beginning of an evolutionary process. In other words, how organic matter evolves and how it came to be in the first place are separate questions. Okay? There's no necessary link there. An advanced intelligent extraterrestrial would not answer the question of ultimate origin either, due to the philosophically incoherent notion that a created thing brought the creation into existence. In other words, you believe there's an extraterrestrial out there. And I've never seen this claim, even in the UFO literature. I mean, nobody's going to say that ET created the universe. They usually say ET created us or something like that. So even if there is a ET, then that just raises the question, okay, where'd you come from? Where did it come from? And again, to Christians in this group, they would just say, well, God put you here too. So, why don't you submit to him or something like that? Many Christians and theologians have argued that the biblical text itself, it's kind of interesting, I threw this in as a side note, may lend validity to the evolutionary process. I'm not saying this is my position, but it is interesting. Genesis 1:24, God said, "Let the earth bring forth every living creature." And what is in there that's kind of curious? You have the earth bringing forth living things. Not God directly. God starts the process of the earth bringing forth every living creature. Now, some ancient theologians, Gregory of Nyssa, Augustine, actually thought that this implied, and they didn't know the word evolution, but the way they articulated this, they thought, well, maybe that the text actually means what it says here. I'll use Augustine's quote here. He supposed that the Creator, based on this verse, implanted seeds or potencies of each separate kind of organism in the created universe from the first moment of its existence. He made all things together, disposing them in an order based not on the intervals of time, but on causal connections. there was, catch this, invisibly present all that would later develop. Okay, that was Augustine, based on Genesis 1:24. So again, this is turf that Christian theologians have covered before. This is nothing new. If God did indeed create life all over the universe, it is reasonable to expect a genetic relationship. Again, and these are my responses. You remember back a few slides ago, one of the questions dealt with, well, what if there's ET and what if he's genetically similar to us? Would that bother you? I'm saying, well, why should it bother you? It's reasonable to expect a genetic relationship between that life and Earth life on the basis of genetic relationships between life forms on Earth. If they all have the common creator, why would this be a shock? If the Human Genome Project has taught the lay public anything, it is that we are genetically similar to more life forms on Earth than we previously thought. Does this prove we made those life forms? No, of course not. It doesn't prove they made us either. Using ET life of any kind as a proof of a cause and effect relationship is not logically coherent. It is not sufficient on this point to assume a cause-effect relationship because we presume they're technologically superior to us either. For example, we're technologically superior to apes, but we're not their creators. Again, the logic fails. There is no necessary conclusion to draw here. Now, we've covered the logically unnecessary link. Let's move to the second category, what I will call today's modern manufactured theological pseudo-problems or objections. Now, here are the four that we'll cover. Some would say, well, if there is ET, then that undermines the inerrancy of the Bible. Inerrancy refers to the idea that the Bible does not contain errors in anything it affirms, that it actually affirms. Some would say an extraterrestrial reality would overturn the doctrines of redemption and incarnation. This is sort of Thomas Paine's category, objection still around. The third one is, if there are ETs, then this overturns the doctrine of the image of God. In other words, if they're here, if they're real, and they're more intelligent than we are, then that means that we're not the apex of creation, and we're not unique to God, and somehow or another, they have like more of the image than we do. I mean, that there's a problem here. We're going to discuss what the image is and why this just doesn't work either as an objection. And the fourth is, if there are ETs, people would argue that they must be angels. So some people are afraid that if we admit that there are extraterrestrials, or if that fact is actually proven, then there are going to be people out there who say, well, those were the angels of the Bible. They were really aliens. Should that bother us? Is that a theological problem? So those are the four. Let's take the first one. The denial of inerrancy issue. This objection proceeds on the naive assumption that if something is not taught in the Bible, it can't be true. And naive is the operative word there. This objection is so transparently incoherent that it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that it's used only to avoid the discussion. And I really mean that. When I get this, why are you involved in this? And if extraterrestrials are out there, then the Bible's wrong. I think that people just want to try to say that to me to shock me, back into the inerrancy camp. And I never left it in this discussion. But they're saying, oh, if you believe this, then you think the Bible's wrong. It has an error. And I'm saying, no, this is, it's ridiculous. Just because something's not in there doesn't mean it can't be true. For example, the Bible issues no statement declaring that there isn't extraterrestrial life. The Bible doesn't tell us about microwaves, gravity, the known planets, toilet paper, whatever. And that doesn't mean they aren't real, especially things like the known planets and gravity. I mean, the planets aren't listed in the Bible. Because it's not in the Bible, then should we say that the Bible affirms that there aren't 9 planets? I mean, the logic here is just, it's incoherent and it's just very naive. Hence, a genuine extraterrestrial reality doesn't amount to overturning any biblical statement. It just doesn't. And my question is, why is it the burden of the Genesis narrative or the Bible as a whole to mention everything that's real? I mean, why does it need to do that? I also think that inerrancy is a wrong-headed objection because inerrancy itself is subject to interpretation. For instance, you have to determine what's an error. You also have to determine what is cultural, what's metaphorical, what's just literary. I mean, it just opens a whole spectrum of sub-issues that you have to deal with. So the term is so elastic that a genuine extraterrestrial reality is really no threat to the doctrine. What about incarnation and redemption, though, the second one? back to Thomas Paine's objection. I think this objection is kind of odd because on the one hand, some have used it to require the notion that an intelligent ET would have to be viewed as God incarnate. In other words, replacing Christ. What I mean here is when Paine first came up with this idea that Jesus has to go live and die and resurrect on every planet, some said, well, maybe God has a Jesus or a Messiah on every planet in that indigenous population. So that was one sort of response that came up. And again, there's nothing biblically that requires this at all, so it is a non sequitur. The matter of redemption, though, I think has received more attention in Paine's traditional articulation. And I still think the objection lacks force because it is because of several problems here. It just doesn't cohere. So I'm going to focus on redemption here. It is related to the incarnation, obviously. You can't have redemption without the incarnation, but let's just camp here for the sake of this section of the lecture. To re-explain it, if there are intelligent ETs, then the objection goes, Christ would have had to die for them. The logic here is because Romans 8 and Revelation 21 and 22 tell us that the atonement of Christ ultimately extends the entire universe, that it will be recreated in an Edenic way. Now that's true. Those passages do affirm and tell us that because of the death and resurrection of Christ, that all of creation will be redeemed, will be regenerated. And so let's store that in the back of our minds that much is true. But to use that to say that Jesus would have to die for everything in, every other intelligent being in the creation is, again, a separate issue. But the argument goes, if they're intelligent aliens, they'd have to be included in this. And yet the Bible doesn't say anything. Maybe this is a little clearer. C.S. Lewis, a very famous author, Christian apologist, who did not himself object to the idea of intelligent extraterrestrial life. He actually wrote a trilogy, his space trilogy, with this as its core. Perhaps some of you have read that. But he put the argument this way. If the universe is teeming with life, this, we are told, reduces to absurdity the Christian claim that to only this one planet, God came down and was incarnate for us and our salvation. So that's the way he put the objection. A little more modern, Nancy Murphy, who teaches at Fuller Theological Seminary, which is an evangelical school, put it this way. She says that the problem is put forth that it would be inconsistent to assume the existence of other life forms capable of responding to the overtures of God, and yet deny the possibility of any event on other planets that's comparable to God's action in Jesus. So again, these are just people who have written on this. Now, I've included Paul Davies' 2 cents on this. Paul Davies is a name you might be familiar with. He is in the field of physics, does a lot of writing on extraterrestrial life. He is not a Christian. I don't know what he is. He's either an atheist or an agnostic. Frankly, when atheists or agnostics do theology, it isn't pretty. It's the same thing here. But I'll read his quotation because I'm going to interact with it. Of all the world's major religions, Christianity is the most species specific. Jesus Christ was humanity's savior and redeemer. He didn't die for the dolphins or the gorillas, and certainly not for the proverbial little green men. Then Davies asked, but what of the deeply spiritual aliens? Are they not to be saved? Can we contemplate a universe that contains perhaps 1 trillion worlds of saintly beings? He's equating saintly beings with this deeply spiritual thing, like, because I'm deeply spiritual, then God has to save me. But in which the only beings eligible for salvation inhabit a planet where murder, rape, and other evils remain rife. So what he's doing here is he's saying that the reason God offers salvation is if you're good, which is a complete misunderstanding of the gospel. But continuing with Davies, those few Christian theologians who have addressed this thorny issue divide into 2 camps. Some posit multiple incarnations and even multiple crucifixions, God taking on little green flesh to save little green men, as a prominent Anglican minister once told me. But most are appalled by this idea or find it ludicrous. After all, in the Christian view of the world, Jesus was God's only son. Would God have the same person born, killed, and resurrected in endless succession on planet after planet? So he's in the Thomas Paine camp pretty clearly here. Now, the way I would respond to this is, it's true that the New Testament teaches all creation is redeemed, but it is an assumption, and I think perhaps flawed, that the cosmos needs to be redeemed in a moral guilt sense. Now, what I mean here, and I'll return to this in a moment, is the reason in Christian theology that Christ became incarnate and died on the cross was that mankind, because he was morally guilty before God, had to be redeemed. Okay, that was the whole rationale for it. And what I'm suggesting here is I think it's a flawed assumption that everything in the cosmos is guilty before God and even needs to be redeemed. But we'll come back to that. Christianity does not teach we're morally guilty before God because we're intelligent or spiritual. We are in that state because God applies Adam's guilt to all humans. All right? That's what the Bible actually says. The other problem with what Davies says is salvation cannot be earned and is never deserved in biblical theology, but is granted to all those who put their faith in what Jesus did. As such, Davies' comments in particular show a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel to begin with. If God did not apply moral guilt to aliens, and of course there's no biblical indication he did, presuming they exist, then the objection is moot. They don't need to be redeemed in a moral sense, because they're not guilty before God. The effect of Adam's sin does not pass to them. Hence, E.T. may be of no concern when it comes to the plan of redemption. E.T. would need no savior, wouldn't go to heaven or hell. I don't like to put it this way, but E.T. could be on, in terms of heaven or hell, the level of an animal that is not guilty before God, and hence he's not going to suffer forever if he doesn't believe in Jesus. There are other human beings, in fact, I would say, again, this is my own view of Romans 5:12, who do not incur guilt before God, but the effect of what Adam did to them is somehow different. And again, I'm not terribly committed to this view, but I think it's possible that when Romans 5:12, if you're not familiar with it, says, Paul says, "For whereas by one man sin entered into the world," that's Adam, "and death by sin, so that death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned." This is usually taken to mean that when Adam sinned, his guilt was transferred to every human being, and so every human being needs to be redeemed. They need to believe in Jesus, or else they're going to go to hell. Well, if you actually take the verse pretty literally, the only thing that passes upon men is death, and you can easily translate it with the result that all men sin. In other words, what Adam did might only result in mortality, and the fact that now that we're born, every human being will inevitably sin and become guilty before God, but is not necessarily guilty before they sin. Again, it's possible. It's a fairly common theological view when discussing the atonement. But I put in this category babies, abortion victims, people who are severely retarded, people who can't believe. And I'm just suggesting that, hey, there could be another category where human beings are taken care of by the atonement, but not in a moral guilt way. There are other non-human beings who are excluded from the category. Animals don't need a savior in the moral sense, yet they are part of the new heaven and new earth. Perhaps aliens, if they exist, are in that category. So, they're subsumed in the recreation, the regeneration of the cosmos because of what Jesus did. But they're not in danger of going to hell. Fallen gods or fallen angels are another category who have no chance of salvation. Perhaps those beings who portray themselves as aliens are in this category, and a lot of Christians think they are. If that's the case, then the atonement is a non-issue again. Is this a real threat to the doctrine of redemption? In Hebrews 2:9, we do see that this idea of the atonement, its broad effect, Paul, or the writer of Hebrews, whoever you think that is, says, "We do see Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, now crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. It was fitting that God, for whom and through whom all things exist, in bringing many children to glory," and so on and so forth. I'll skip to the next line. "For this reason God is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters, saying, I will proclaim your name to my brothers and sisters. In the midst of the congregation I will praise you. Since," continuing, Therefore, the children share flesh and blood. He himself likewise share the same things, so that through death he might destroy the one who has the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who were held in slavery. Here's the important line. For it is clear that he did not come to help angels, but the descendants of Abraham. It's very clear that the angels, especially the fallen angels, are not included in the redemption, in the atonement. So again, there's precedent for a category of intelligent beings not being included in the atonement. The fact that they're intelligent has nothing to do with whether Jesus needs to die for them. What about the idea that all created things will be redeemed, though, going back to that theme? Romans 8, you go down here to verse 22, or verse 21 here. The creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay and will obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. Up here, the creation is waiting and eagerly longing for the revealing of the children of God. This is an eschatological and end times kind of thing, that when Christ returns, creation will be ultimately renewed sometime after his return. Colossians 1, you have the context here is we're discussing, Paul's discussing the Father, God the Father, and Jesus. God uses Jesus to rescue us from the power of darkness and transfer us into the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. Going on, Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of creation, so on and so forth. If you get down here to the red, through him, through Jesus, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. So this idea is biblical, but the point of the redemption of all creation is not to undo moral guilt. The earth isn't guilty, animals aren't guilty. It's to make it what it once was, to give it new life, to set it in right relationship to him as it was in Eden. So again, to summarize this, just because there's an intelligent extraterrestrial does not mean that that intelligent extraterrestrial is guilty before God. And if that's the case, Jesus doesn't need to go to every planet and die. Okay? ET might benefit with the rest of the cosmos from the atonement, but there's no need for God to look down at planet whatever and say, oh boy, there's a population down there, I better go send a Messiah there. The whole point of the Messiahship to specific individuals was that they're morally guilty and they need a means of forgiveness. And there's no biblical warrant to say that ET needs that. Third one, if there are ETs, then this overturns the doctrine of the image of God. This objection requires a little explanation. Supposedly, if there are intelligent extraterrestrials, then the special relationship humans have with God, which is defined as this image idea, is overturned. In reality, the understanding that an intelligent ET would not have been created in God's image and so would not usurp humanity's uniqueness is the primary reason Christianity could sustain an extraterrestrial reality. Now, to explain that, most Christians, and you'll read this if you read theology books, it's very common to say that the image of God is these things. You know, it's intelligence, it's communication ability, you have a soul, a conscience, free will, abstract thought, whatever. So the supposition is that, hey, if there comes along another critter, another being that has these things, or even a couple of them, then that means that humankind is not unique. Humankind is not created in the image of God exclusively, like the Bible says. So there must be a problem with the Bible. That's the way the argument goes. And again, as you well know, I don't buy it. The reason that the image is not any of those things, and that's the key, the image is not an ability or some capacity. The reason that that's not the case is because of several reasons, and I'll try to follow this here. The image is, true, what makes mankind distinguishably and certifiably unique in relation to any other created thing in the universe. The image must be something possessed in its entirety, equally and fully by every human being. In Genesis 1:26, when God says, "Let us make humankind in our image," the whole point is that I'm going to create humanity in such a way that he is distinct from everything else I've created. And since we're created in his image, male and female, and every male and female has it, it's not something you get in stages, okay? You either have it or you don't. Now these conditions are again mandated by this passage, Genesis 1, okay, the famous image passage, let us make humankind in our image and in our likeness. Genesis 5, we have the phrase again, God creates humankind in the likeness of God. Genesis 9, a very famous verse dealing with capital punishment. Whoever sheds blood of humankind, by humankind shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God has God made humankind. My own position, as you're going to see in the next couple slides, is that the image is not a thing, an ability we have. It's not something put in us. It's something we are. It is a status that we have. We are God's representatives on earth. We are God's imagers, which explains this command. God was offended at murder. If you kill a human being, it is as though you killed God in effigy, because humans are his representatives, his stand-ins, so to speak, on the planet. And that was offensive. Now some observations. All men and women are image bearers, according to that Genesis passage. The image, of course, makes us distinct. There's something about the image that makes humankind like God. And the image is not incremental or partial. What I think it is, and I've already tipped my hand here, and this is based on a point of Hebrew grammar, is the image is something we are, not something we have. This is the phrase in Hebrew, B'Tselem is how you would say this, in the image. This little letter is a preposition in Hebrew. They're attached to the front of words. Now think about the way we use the word in. Okay, we use the word in a lot of different ways. If I say, put the dishes in the sink, in that sentence denotes location. Okay? If I say, write this letter in pencil, what I mean there is that the pencil is the instrument that you use for writing. If I say, I work in education, I work in the medical field, what I mean is this. I work as a teacher. I work as a doctor. I work as a nurse. In other words, that is my function. I work in the capacity of education or medicine. And I'm suggesting we take this meaning of the word in and put it back in Genesis 1:26. We are created as God's image. We are created to function in the capacity of his image. We're created to be him as though he were here. We're created to be his representatives, his imagers. Think of it verbally. It's a function, not a thing. And all human beings have an ordained destiny to carry out or reject as his imagers. Now, how does this relate? E.T. has not been put in charge of earth, as Genesis 1:26 and 27 says humans are. Hence, he is not an imager of God. Humanity would therefore remain unique. It would retain a special relationship between humans and God. If E.T. comes along, and let's say he's more intelligent, that doesn't undo the image, because the point of the image is that I, God, am placing you, humans, on the earth to rule it, to take care of it, to nurture it, like I would do if I were physically there. I'm putting you in charge. You're my representatives. It doesn't matter if E.T.'s out here somewhere doing his thing on another planet, because God is in a unique, special relationship to humans on this planet, on Earth. Okay? Frankly, it doesn't mean a thing if E.T. is out there. His place is not God's imager on Earth. Maybe God's doing something else with him over there. But the categories, the distinction between the categories can easily be retained. I have here a little rabbit trail. What about the plurals in Genesis, our image? Because everybody asked about this. And to get a full answer to this, you're going to have to get some of the other tapes from the sessions. But it's true that the members of the divine council, God's heavenly host, are also God's imagers in some sense. They do rule. They do exercise authority. That is true. Humankind is still unique, though, since humans alone are God's representatives on earth. In fact, in Jewish tradition, and I would say in biblical theology as well, the whole point of the initial rebellion of the Nachash, Lucifer, the serpent, whatever term you want to use there, was because he, as a superior being to Adam and Eve, did not want to submit to the idea that God was putting them in charge. Okay, we're more capable, we're better looking, we're smarter, or whatever. Why should we bow the knee to these two, things that you've just created? The fact that heavenly beings can also serve God does not undo the fact that humans alone are his representatives on earth. God put humanity in charge, not some other being. And again, the whole Jewish tradition about Satan thinking this was ludicrous falls into that category. Now, finally, the fourth argument, well, if there are ETs, then people are going to go running around saying that they're the angels of the Bible, and then we're going to have aliens in the Bible, and that's a problem, so on and so forth. Well, I would suggest you look at it this way. To be honest, if there are ETs, and if you're thinking this, that, I just can't wait to have ETs in the Bible, sort of, running the show or whatever, I would suggest to you need to think twice about that. I don't think you'd really want to do this if you're not a Christian, especially. Here's why. There are 4 problems with identifying angels with extraterrestrials. And again, I'm defining extraterrestrial as a being who has a determinate lifespan, who lives on another planet, who has to eat, who has to procreate to sustain his own race, who has to survive. In other words, he's not an immortal. Okay, he's not an entity, an immortal entity. But that is exactly the way that Jewish and Christian texts describe angels. They're described as immortal. They do not have determined lifespans. For instance, some verses here. Mark 12:25. For when they, in the context is referring to people, when they rise from the dead, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. Okay, they don't need to reproduce. They will live indefinitely like angels in heaven. Jude 1:6, the angels who did not keep their own position, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains. I would suggest to you that if the sentence is eternal, then the victim of the sentence is also viewed as eternal. Wouldn't make any sense. What's the point of having an eternal punishment if the being is not going to be around for it? Second problem, or second issue, is angels, Hebrew and malachim, are always depicted in human form. In other words, you never have a malach, that's the singular, an angel, ever depicted in non-human form. You have other categories. You have cherubim and seraphim and whatnot. But when the scriptures use this term, angel, and then describe what the angel is doing or what he looks like, they resembled people. You could not tell the difference. The best example here is the Sodom and Gomorrah story, where the 2 angels who had been along with the Lord, with Yahweh, in human form, in Genesis 18, they have a meal with Abraham, and then God sends the 2 angels to Sodom and Gomorrah because he's going to punish and destroy the city. When they get there, Lot doesn't know they're angels. When they get to Abraham's nephew's house, Lot, he welcomes them like they're any other human visitor. He has no idea who they are. It's only when they strike the city with blindness that Lot, it kind of clicks with him. Like, well, I can't do that. That's something people can't do. They must be something more. And in fact, they were. The only really, in the UFO literature, it's only the Nordics that would really resemble in any way angels that are described in the Bible. But there are some incongruities here, but for the most part, there's some overlap there. Angels are never said as well to need flying craft to get from one place to the other. They're truly extra-dimensional, or I guess you could say intra-dimensional beings. There's only one verse that, there's a verse that is commonly used to say that angels are flying around in craft. Psalm 68:17 in the King James, but the word angel actually isn't even in here. King James puts it in, but malachim in Hebrew is not there. This is a literal translation. JPS is the Jewish Publication Society version. In many ways, it's a very literal translation. It says that God's chariots are myriads upon myriads, thousands upon thousands. The Lord is among them as in Sinai in holiness. Now, again, the supposition is that, the myriads upon myriads are angels, but, the word isn't actually there, but we'll concede that point, that the supposition is that they're angels. Same would be true in Elisha, in his case in 2 Kings 6, where I'm not going to go through the whole story, but Elisha prays that his servant can see the heavenly army that's protecting him, and God opens his eyes and he sees the hills all around Elisha covered with horses and chariots of fire. By the way, the mention of horses here with chariots, I don't recall reading in the UFO literature UFOs that need horses. I mean, this is just a common ancient version of what they actually saw. And I mention that to say this. As I said last night in the Ezekiel session, the biblical writer, the ancient Hebrew writer, has words for silvery, silver, disc, round, circle, window. I mean, all the features of a common UFO. These are just simple words across the board in every Semitic language, but they don't use them to describe the chariots. They just use the word for chariot, drawn by horses. It's an appearance, again, to create the impression for Elisha and his servant that God has an army protecting them. It's not that God's saying, hey, we're really all here in UFOs. Otherwise, I mean, why didn't he describe that? Fourth, are ETs, scratch the R there, are they the angels of the Bible? Now, fourth problem, if they're to be misidentified in New Testament texts, then logic would compel us to accept whatever else the New Testament says about them. What I mean by this, in other words, is that it is intellectually inconsistent to accept that an ET reality is, quote, provable from the Bible, and then to turn around and reject what the Bible says about those beings. If you want to say that the angels of the Bible are extraterrestrials, then I want you to be consistent. I want you to then accept and affirm and believe and obey whatever else the Bible says about those ETs, those angels. And here are some examples. And I don't think, if you're not a Christian, I don't think you're going to want to do this. Here's why. Some examples. Angels, ETs in question mark there, save only the followers of Christ at the rapture, or the second coming, if you don't like the rapture idea. So if you're not a Christian, ET is going to kiss you goodbye. Angels, ETs, announced that Jesus was in fact the Messiah. So again, if you're not a Christian, you better get your act together. ET says, ET affirmed, ET declared that Jesus in fact was the Messiah. ETs are also inferior to and are subject to Jesus Christ. He is their authority. ETs, angels, carry out the wrath of God on the earth and unbelievers at the time of Armageddon. So again, if you're here when Christ comes back with his ETs, as people are so fond of saying, as he comes back with his army of UFOs and extraterrestrials, if you're not a Christian, you're in heap big trouble. Now, I don't think I've ever found someone who really would be willing to embrace a lot of these things if they're not a Christian. My experience has been that most people who want to say that the angels of the Bible are extraterrestrials are very hostile to the Judeo-Christian worldview. And I'm just asking, I'm not really asking, I'm just telling you, you're inconsistent. You have, again, the pick and choose approach to the Bible. You pick what you like, you discard what you don't. One must decide one of two things about the angels or ETs idea. Either don't identify them, number one, or number two, explain how it in fact is intellectually honest of you to pick and choose. And I don't think you can do that. Now, one last thought. While it is certainly true that Christianity can accommodate an extraterrestriality, there are two aspects of the alien debate that Christian theology today would still reject. One is the assertion that ETs created humanity. What I'm saying here, by way of sort of a summation, is that, look, on the one hand, it's perfectly easy and perfectly reasonable, perfectly workable for someone who's a conservative Jew or conservative Christian to accept the idea that there could be a real extraterrestrial. The problem comes in this linkage, this assertion here. And second, again, the possibility that while angels are not the ETs, the beings that present themselves are somehow the evil fallen sons of God. This is where you're going to find a lot of Christians nowadays, their resistance to the idea. But what I'm saying to you is that there's no, while this can be articulated, this can be explained, this can have a coherence of its own, I think that Christian theologians should also admit and tell their people that maybe this doesn't have to be the case, and we can have an extraterrestrial reality, and still affirm the faith. That is what I have for today. We can take question and answer, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what time it is, so I'm going to rely on the tape guys. We do? Okay. All right. Okay. So we're gonna have Bill come. Where are you, guy? Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's just stop then. Okay. No, he wants to get started with the next one. Okay. World. For them, the discovery of other life, rather than any other space product, would be electrifying. And if you go down to the last line, if superintelligence is discovered, the results become quite unpredictable. To summarize this quotation, what they're saying is, look, people who are really, in these conservative religious groups, if you actually found intelligent life out there in the universe, this would be a really disturbing prospect for them, to the point where the results become quite unpredictable. We don't know what would happen. And this stance on the part of NASA, on the part of the government, has sort of carried the day as far as disclosure questions. You always hear this when the subject of why doesn't the government just be more honest? Why don't they act more forthrightly? If you saw Richard Dolan's presentation and John Greenwald, you'll know that the government specializes in obfuscation when it comes to getting any information about what it actually knows. And part of the reason that they would give, and have given in print, is that the social religious fabric of not only our country but around the world would just be too dramatically affected. Now, to be a little more precise though, the people we're talking about here and the people I'm talking to in this tape are theological conservatives. And what that means is people who, again, in the Judeo-Christian camp, who would take the Bible at face value, would believe that it's inspired and authoritative, and that it contains an accurate, but perhaps not necessarily complete, record of creation events. These are the people that the Brookings Report were afraid would just not be able to handle this, as opposed to theological liberals. And what is a theological liberal? Well, this is someone who doesn't really view the Bible as the only authority or infallible. It is quite open to negative criticism. And the reason I point this out is that nearly everything that you'll read, if you actually went to do some research on this, what about Christianity and extraterrestrial life, almost everything that's been produced has been produced by or for the theological liberal camp. In other words, those whose view of the Bible is, and I'll say it this way, is low enough that, we really don't care. If an ET would come along and that sort of produces the assumption, or in our minds the fact that the Bible is wrong, we would expect the Bible to be wrong anyway, so who cares? We're not talking to that camp. We're talking to people whose worldview does not allow for a Bible, a text, their religious book, to just be riddled with errors, and to make an error so fundamental as to the matter of extraterrestrial life. So I want to be clear as to who I'm speaking to. And I'm specifically speaking to those who are conservative. Now, there has been one attempt recently to sort of assess in the mind of the researchers how the religious community in our country would respond to an extraterrestrial reality. And I'm going to tip you off as to where I'm going here. This survey, which you may have heard of, if you perhaps have been to the NIDS website. If you haven't, I recommend it. There's a lot of good stuff on it. But the NIDS people paid for and commissioned, conducted something called the Alexander UFO Religious Crisis Survey. And this is taken directly from the website, from the survey's own abstract. And what they did, to summarize here, is they sent out 1,000 surveys to find out what the impact would be from essentially the mouths of the spiritual leaders in various denominations and congregations. You'll notice at the bottom, the results that they got are based on a 23% return. So 230 of the 1,000 surveys were returned. The country was also divided into 5 regions to do this methodologically. And 563 of the surveys wound up going to Protestant churches of various denominations, 396 to Roman Catholic churches, and 41 to Jewish synagogues. So they tried to sort of hit representationally the major groups. It was put forth that there actually is an intelligent, I'm not talking microscopic particles here, but that there's an intelligent extraterrestrial reality, and this is actually proven scientifically beyond any reasonable doubt. If that's the case, and if it can indeed be divorced from all this demonic stuff, then what would the impact be on the Judeo-Christian worldview? And those are the presuppositions we're going to take into this and the question we're going to ask. Now, there is a problem as implied in the title. The title suggests that there are many in the Judeo-Christian camp who would be troubled. Hence, if not, why ask the question? This all goes back to, by way of introduction, to something called the Brookings Report, as far as the attitude today that if there was an extraterrestrial, Jews who take the Scriptures seriously, Christians who take the Scriptures seriously, just could not handle this. That approach, that idea, that assumption really goes back to Brookings as far as people in the know. And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but the Brookings Report was done roughly in round numbers in 1960, congressional report for NASA, and part of it dealt with the implications of the discovery of extraterrestrial life. And this paragraph more or less just says, the first line here, anthropological files contain many examples of societies, speaking here of human societies, sure of their place in the universe, which have disintegrated when they had to associate with previously unfamiliar societies, espousing different ideas of different life ways. Now, what that means is that anthropologists, people who study people and cultures, I sort of pointed out the obvious. When one culture encounters another culture, and that encounter sort of displaces what they thought about themselves, it can be a disturbing experience. Well, we all know that, but the Brookings Report went even further. It actually, this is a direct quote from a footnote on page 225. It actually says that fundamentalist and anti-science sects are growing apace around the world. And just by way of prepping this, by way of sort of setting this up, if you're at all familiar with me, or if you heard one of the other sessions, you know that I really have 2 sort of operating paradigms for this kind of question. And in my book, The Facade, I actually cover both of them. One is that what we see as the extraterrestrial phenomenon, and I do take it seriously. I do take people, take their experiences as credible reports. There are always some that are making something up or just need attention, but I think the vast majority of people who, let's say, experience some sort of abduction experience, that I don't think everybody's lying. I do think there are credible researchers in this area that have produced a lot of good work to suggest that these people should be taken seriously. But one possibility for all that is that what we're dealing with here, especially in view of the correlations with the abduction scenario, what you read in the literature from abductee testimony, what we could be dealing with here is some sort of mimicry of a Genesis 6 type event, where you have some sinister operation here, where the sons of God or some sort of entity, some sort of divine entity, fallen entity in biblical theology and later Jewish theology, where you have this activity sort of repeated, that it's sinister, it's evil. These entities aren't really extraterrestrials, defined as beings who actually live on another planet, who have determinate lifespans, who need to eat, who reproduce, who hate their jobs and all that kind of stuff. Just have a mundane existence. They could be actual entities masquerading as extraterrestrial gods. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, to set this up again, is that let's just set all that aside that I just said, the Genesis 6 stuff, the demonic stuff, And let's just assume, for the sake of the session, that ET lands on the White House lawn like everybody wants to happen to prove this, or some other proof.
Morning, welcome back to Ancient of Days. Our next speaker here is Michael S. Heiser. He just completed his Ph.D. He's an ancient languages and ancient text and ancient history scholar from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And he is bringing us the question of, if you could actually prove that ETs were real and visiting Earth, or whether they were visiting Earth, what kind of problems might that pose for the Christian worldview? I mean, is man alone according to the Bible, or how unique are we compared to everything else? He's very uniquely qualified. I don't need to tell too much more to waste his time. He can do it a lot better than I am. This is Dr. Michael S. Heiser.
Okay, since we get this started here, as Guy said, I'm more capable than he is of wasting my time. The focus of this session is, as he said, to ask the question, could Christianity accept a genuine extraterrestrial reality?